Today I'm going to be showing you my color grading workflow using both Final Cut and Davinci Resolve, with Final Cut to edit and then Davinci Resolve to color grade. So first, I'll just preface that you can color grade with this workflow at any point in your Final Cut edit process. So it doesn't matter whether you're at the very start or the very end, because you're color grading all of the source files instead of exporting the whole timeline and just color grading the clips that are in the timeline, which is quite often what you see on YouTube. But I found that that just doesn't work at all. It means that you color grade less clips, but it also means that you can't reuse those clips again, which is very annoying. What I've got here is not an actual edit, but just some changes that I've made to this clip with both like audio, retime, basically everything. I'll show you at the end how it doesn't affect any of these edits when you relink the color graded clips in. So first, what you want to do is download these 3 files, because they're the ones that we'll be using today. The one on the right is just a test file, so you can use your own clips, or you can just practice with this if you want. The Davinci test chart is a grayscale chart from 0 to 100 on the Luma scale, and it's got steps as well, which is half a stop of light each one. And then this base.drp is my specific base timeline in Davinci Resolve that I use every single time. I basically duplicate it in the Davinci project window, and then I use that duplicate and edit everything in there. So if you open up the base.drp, it should take you to the media page. You should notice the Davinci test chart and the timeline already in there. If you want to leave them both there, because the timeline actually has pre-made split toning and effect that affect the whole timeline on it. So if you delete it and create a new one, then you lose those effects. If you then want to drag in your clips, so I'm just going to drag this into just the main media bin here. It copies it over, but it's referencing where it's coming from, so it doesn't create an actual copy. And then I'm just going to go into cut, select the clip. You can just select all the clip and then drag it in to the test chart. So now you have the clip here. You'll notice there's already been an effect placed on it because of the timeline, because there's your out color space transform. That's automatically turned on. So I'm just jumping in from the end of the video. I want to explain all of the panels inside of the color space and just kind of break it down really easily. So if you're used to these, then just skip past this bit. Starting from the very left and actually starting in the top right here. So here you've got all your nodes. These are essentially layers, but in a node format from left to right, which is very useful in visualizing it all. And so how it works is your video essentially is input on the left here, and then you can change everything and it's output on the right here. So CST in is the color space transform. It basically changes your log image to Rec79, but I'll explain that later. And then it just feeds into the next node. So the green is the actual video and the blue is the like matte layer. So if you've done a like window, which I'll also explain later, it feeds into there. So yeah, these are your nodes. You also have your effects up here, which I don't have many of because I haven't paid for it. And then moving to the top left with these things, the 2 main ones that you're going to be using are gallery and clips. So gallery basically stores your LUTs, or your like personal made LUT. And how it works is if you right click on an image that you've graded and then press grab still, it creates this essentially LUT, which saves all your entire node tree and puts it up there. And then you can right click on that and apply grade, and it'll apply it to whatever clip you're on. And then the clips just shows you all the clips that are in your timeline, but in clip form, which is really nice. So that's how it differs from other softwares, like it's focused on color grading. And from the bottom left, camera raw, as if your camera shoots in raw, skipping over that. Color match is if you have one of those color match boards that you basically show to camera and use that to match everything. These are your primary wheels. I don't use these as much now that I use the HDR wheels, but they essentially do the same thing. Lift is for your shadows, gamma is for your midtones, gain is for your highlights, and offset is for the entire image. You drag them around to change the colors, increase the exposure with the thing at the bottom, and you can fine tune the colors with the numbers up top. It then also has your temperature, tint, contrast, pivot, which is where the contrast pivots from. So the contrast stretches out the image from a certain point. If you change the pivot down, it like shifts it. Mid detail, which is, yeah, like detail. Color boost, shadows, highlights, these are all kind of self-explanatory. Saturation, hue. Hue is quite a good one. If you look at the vector scope, it like rotates the vector scope, which is kind of cool. Then you also have your log wheels, which is that, but slightly, I find you can fine tune it more. But then HDR wheels, which is what I basically solely use. Love these things. They just let you select specific areas a lot easier. And they have these extra exposure and saturation for each bit, which is much more preferable. RGB mixer, never use it. Motion effects, don't pay for it, so don't have them. Spatial noise reduction and stuff. Then you've got your curves, which have all these different curves, which you need to just play around with. Color warper, which I used to use, don't use it much anymore, but you can basically shift the colors in a certain direction and change the saturation. qualifier, which selects certain parts of the image based on their hue, saturation and luminance, windows, which give you windows of the image, tracker, which affects the windows, blur, don't use them very much, key, which changes how much the node affects the image, input sizing, don't use that either, and 3D, which I'm not even allowed to use because I haven't paid for it. And then you have your scopes over here, which are essentially how you can read the image in a data format. So you mainly use waveform and vector scope. Vector scope shows where the image is in regards to colors. So you've got red, magenta, blue, cyan, green, and yellow. So if your image is really yellow, it'll be showing up over here. And then you have your waveform, which shows how bright different parts of the image is from the left to the right. So that you see the left part of the image is dark. As you can see here, the left part of the image is dark. So yeah, that's just a crash course into kind of how everything works, and you just need to play around with it a lot. If you open up your gallery up here, there are 2 stills that I've created, which is essentially Davinci's LUTs section, but ones that you've made. This one on the left is if you're working with a camera that doesn't have log, it's called 709 for Rec 709. So if your camera outputs Rec 709, you just use that. And then there's C-Log 3, which is for C-Log 3. But also if you don't have a camera that has C-Log 3, I'll show you how to set that up. So you want to right click this and apply grade. If you have multiple clips, you open up the clips panel, click on this, hold shift, and then select the last clip, and then right click apply grade, and it'll apply it to all of them. First, I'll show you how to make it for your camera. So you select this CST in, which essentially changes your camera's color space to Davinci wide gamut and Davinci intermediate, which is the best place for you to color grade on because it's got the most flexibility. So if you open up effects in the top right here, these 2 things are what you're going to want to be changing. So let's say you have a Sony, you can click on this. I just pressed S to get to S, and then you choose whichever log you're using. So let's say S gamut 3 is the color space, and then the gamma would be S log 3. So go S log 3, and then this would basically make your S log 3 Rec 709. But I'm going to go into the gallery, apply C log 3 because that's the one that works for my camera. This is your main node tree for each clip. I'll explain how to go through them from the start till the end. So starting off with exposure, I much prefer the HDR wheels. I used to hate them. I used to only use the log primaries, but once I figured out that these wheels selected different luma portions of the clip, then I realized that it was much more useful. And if you hold this thing in the top left of each luma wheel, you can see what part of the image it's affecting. So for dark, if I hold this, it only affects those areas that you can see. But for this first exposure node, I want to just be affecting mainly this exposure slider on the global, which affects the whole part of the image. Now, to get a proper exposure, you might have heard of false colors before, and I've created essentially a fake or my own false colors inside of here. So if you go into timeline, which you can do by going into the top right in timeline, or you click this dot on the right, you see there's false colors that's automatically turned off because it looks like this, which obviously you don't want to be color grading in. But the reason why it's useful is because you're able to check skin tones with the false colors. And essentially how it works, so I'm going to enter it, show compound node. I have all these selections and they have the percentage luma at the top. So 0 to 5, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, so on, and then 95 to 100. So this basically shows me what's clipping in the highlights. And then I have these 4 to show me skin tones, because when you're color grading, you actually want to pull the skin tones around quite a bit. So your highlights will want to, for a white person, they can be in the 70s. And your shadows can be in the 30s or 40s or even lower than that. But I found this is really good. And the way that I remember the colors is YRGB, because that's how things are normally, you can see it just down here, YRGB, and Y is the luma, but it's yellow for this. So it's yellow, red, green, blue. And so how I made it is, if you go into the qualifier here, I basically figured out which portions related to which percentages in the waveform. And then I selected those portions and changed the colors using the curves. It's relatively straightforward, but you don't really need to know how it works. You just need to know how to use it. This white skin, so it's YRGB. So B would normally be the highlights in a really sunny area, so like quite bright. So maybe I don't think I'd want to have any of it in B. So I do R and G, let's say. So I will go into my clip, which only affects this clip, and bring my exposure up until, yeah. So I'll bring my exposure up until the green is in the highlights and the red is in the midtones. So there is quite a lot of leeway with this kind of fake false colors thing. And obviously I've just made it myself. It's not something I've downloaded professionally from the internet. If you turn off that, regardless of the rest of the image, it's really washed out because it's quite a dark image. The skin tones are in quite a good exposure. So back to my clip, you go to balance net and then you want to change your waveform to vector scope. The main thing you want to be focusing on is this skin tone indicator, which is this line, which is where all skin tones should kind of be. And I find even if you're not doing skin tones, it's quite a pleasing area for colors to be. So even if you're color grading a landscape shot, if you have a sunset, it's quite nice to get it close to that line. So for these three nodes, I want to basically be getting the shot to neutral, and then with the rest of the nodes, I'm going to be making it more creative. For this balance, I want to try and center this vector scope using the global HDR wheel. So you can just drag it like that. And you can see here, this kind of white ball is around the center. You can do this different ways. If you right click and do show, pick a RGB value and put it on a white value, you can see the exact RGB values and match them until they're all the same. But I find, like for example, this helmet is more blue because it's in the shade, so it will be more blue. And this is washed out highlight, so it doesn't have white information anyway. So it's generally quite hard to find that. And once you've found it, it's quite hard to tweak it. So I turn that off. I generally do it by eye when I'm using this Big Mac, it's quite easy to. So there, neutral, if you turn it off and on, you can see you just remove that blue hue, which you couldn't really tell was there before, but when you turn it on and off, you can really see that it's there. So contrast, I then go back to waveform. I vary with how I do this. It kind of depends on the shot. So one way to do it is with the curves, another is with the HDR contrast, another is with the primary wheels contrast, and then you can also use false colors if you want to. For using the curves, you'd want to select the luminance curve. You just press on that, and then it doesn't affect any of the R, G, or B. Preferably what you'd want to do is select the skin tones on the curve so that you don't affect them when you're changing the contrast. So you can do that by using the qualifier tool or just your mouse and clicking on the skin when you're on the curves. So you see if I click there, it creates 4 different points for Y, RGB, but I don't want to have the red, green, and blue because I'm not going to be affecting them. So I think if you press undo, it removes them. So if you press undo 3 times, then you're only left with the luma pointer on where the skin tone is. The reason why you want to have that where the skin tone is because you don't want to be affecting the exposure of the skin tone because you've already got it perfect, so you don't want to change it anymore. And then you can grab above and below, and normally most people like to use an S-curve. So I'll just add in a slight S-curve here, depends on how I like, turn it off and on. You can see I've just added quite a bit of contrast. This sky is completely blown out, so I might bring it down a bit. But yeah, that's quite a nice way to do it. And if you hold Option whilst grabbing one of these pointers, hold Option, it locks to the axis. If you look at his skin specifically, it actually doesn't change values too much. And if you look at the waveform, it's pivoting around a certain area around 50, which is where his skin is. Now the shot is neutral. Now you can start to add looks to it. The way that I like to do this is by scene. If I have 5 shots that are all at the beach, I'd want to have the same look on all of them, and that kind of helps you get all the clips consistent, because that's what's really hard about color grading, is getting each shot to look the same. So these 3 nodes up here are affecting just that node, and then I like to use these nodes down here to affect the entire scene. And I've named them so that I just remember. First one is skin adjustment, so depending on the scene, you'd want to affect the person's skin, but sometimes there isn't skin in the shot, so maybe you can use that as selecting a specific area. But I'll show you how to do the skin adjustment. So you want to select qualifier, open the qualifier menu here, and then click on skin. You'll see something's happened, but how to see what you've selected is by pressing this button in the top left, and it shows you never really a very good kind of selection of the skin. So the first thing that I like to do is reduce the width of the hue down really low, because generally skin is one specific hue, and for some reason the qualifier always selects a really wide range of hues. And then you want to move the center so that it's in the middle of where the skin is. So I think here is pretty good. And then I'll increase the width until most of the skin is selected. You can zoom in a bit. You can see that most of the skin is selected here. Right, I'll zoom back out again, pressing Z. Then you can change all the other ones. So you're basically trying to only get the skin in on the high. And you can change the softness. It's always nice to change the softness, because if you get these dots in the top right, it'll add in quite a lot of noise. And then you can change the luminance. So you can see I'm starting to get just the skin. a lot of the time there will be this extra stuff, and if you want to really remove that, you can add a window. So I could add a circle window. See, it removes all the stuff outside of the circle window. I also want his hands in the shot here, and then you can use tracking and just press the forwards and backwards. I feel this never really needs to be too accurate because you're never really changing the skin tones very much, but sometimes it's quite useful. You can then turn back off that selection and turn off the window selector and affect the skin tones. So this depends completely on the scene, but if you open up the vector scope and shift around, you can see this like arm is moving around, which is where the skin's going, and you can see his skin is going crazy. So if you match that up with the skin tone line and then just look at the image and change the saturation and just drag it closer to the center, I think that's pretty good. Might be a bit too saturated, but let's see the difference before and after. Nice. So yeah, I think that's a bit too saturated, but doesn't matter too much for now. So I do this in the skin adjustments. These are all parallel nodes, so they basically don't have an effect on one another, but they all come together at the end. Whereas these are serial nodes, and it's like one after the other. So exposure then feeds into the balance. Curves, you can kind of do whatever you want. You can do another S curve, or you can look at the other curves like hue versus hue, hue versus saturation. These are all quite interesting things to play around with, and I'd really recommend it because you can do very useful things with them. Exposure for the scene, but after you've done all the neutralization. So if you're filming a scene and if you're using log, you should be overexposing it by a step or two. And if you want the scene to be darker, so this is quite a bright scene, I'd say. If we look at my waveform, it's a pretty good contrast, but it's quite high up. I can just reduce this after the fact, and it still maintains the contrast and all the effects that I've made, but because I'm changing the exposure at the end, it just kind of brings it down. Balance again, you go open up vector scope. Changing the balance for the scene, I quite like doing this. For like beach shots, you can just bring it to yellow or bring it to blue, and then this is mainly where I use the HDR wheels, so I'll go into here, I'll hold this to see, like, and I'll maybe change this to blue, reduce the saturation, look at what the shadows are affecting, maybe change this to red. Basically just go crazy on this and decide what look you want. Highlights, this is a trick that I've kind of seen around. If you press this button again to show what we're selecting, and then bring the luminance up until we're only affecting the highlights like this. And then what you want to do is change the morph operation to grow, and then you want to increase the morph radius to however much you want, and then change the color and increase the exposure. You've got halation. So don't go and buy someone's like £10 halation LUT, because you can just make it free yourself. So this is the scene node tree, but you'll notice I've missed out these three, well, and this one as well. This node is only in there to make it easier to look at. So once I've built up the scene and done the neutralization, I then have these individual nodes, which are basically how to make the individual video look more unique, if that makes any sort of sense. So I have these two, which are both called windows, and then skin exposure. I use this again, I select the skin and increase or decrease the exposure if need be, because generally from scene to scene, you'll want to change the exposure of the individual clip whilst also having the main skin adjustment still there, which is why these are on two different areas, because you don't want to be constantly trying to get the skin to the right line on the vector scope. You just kind of want to have those adjustments set, and then you want to just change the exposure to get it all equal. I'm going to show two ways that you can use these windows, and actually a different way that's not pre-made on this thing. I mean, the first one is to just use your windows normally, so add a gradient here and maybe just increase the exposure. I mean, I'm not doing this for any actual effect, but for example, I'm just going to flip this around, just increase the exposure here, and then you've got some light rays. So that's kind of the normal way that people would use windows. I'm going to show you a more interesting way to do it. I'm going to add an outside node. This basically takes the, I think it's called the matte layer, which is like the outside of your selection that you've made in the Windows node, and reverses it into this node. So let's say in the Windows, I add a circular window. This is generally how I go about doing this. I'd make it wider, increase the feathering by quite a lot, and then center it on the subject. So you can see that it's pretty central on the subject. You can use keyframes or tracking if you want to. You can see in this viewfinder of the nodes here, this is selected the inside and this selects the outside. You can show that with this, outside, and this selects the inside. For the inside, let's say we increase the exposure by just a tiny bit, 0.25, half a stop, increase the contrast slightly. It's slightly messing with our halation, so I'm just going to turn that off. Increase the contrast slightly, decrease the pivot to make it brighter, increase the MD, but it's essentially detail. And then for this one, I'm basically going to do the exact opposite. Decrease the exposure, decrease the contrast, increase the pivot to make it darker, decrease the MD by quite a lot because you can see that it just softens it out, and that's generally a look that people quite like. So I'm going to select both these nodes, open up full screen and turn them on and off to show you what the difference is. So yeah, that's quite a nice way of isolating your subject, and you can see, like here especially, it just softens it out and mellows it out and really focuses your eye towards the center. In these highlights up here, you can see it just mutes them down. That's two ways that you can use windows and how you do all of this. And so then this clip node structure then feeds out into the timeline node structure. So if you open up timeline up here, so the clip output then goes into the timeline input. And you've got these four here. I leave them off because you want to do your clip editing without seeing these. And it also makes your computer run a bit slower, but you don't want to be trying to neutralize the clip whilst you have these effects on. And these effects you kind of add at the end and just change them around slightly based off of what you feel you need to do. But they should never really affect your clips too much. And if they're not working, you should just turn them off or turn them down. But I will turn them on, and let me just full screen it and show you the difference of on and off. So this is on, this is off. So it's a relatively subtle difference, but the main difference you'll notice is the blueness in the shadows. So this is basically called split toning. If you open up curves in the split toning, there are these 2 points here and then kind of open banding here and here. So basically what you're seeing is this point here is where skin generally is, and it's 18% grey, which is actually 45% luma. And then this is another one to kind of make sure there isn't too much effect on the skin. So you're trying to keep the skin exactly the same, and you can see the skin barely changes in this clip because it's also at the right exposure. So that's the other positive of using the false colors, is you're making sure the skin is at the right exposure, which means that it's not affected by split toning. So what this is basically doing is in the highlights, it's making it warmer, and in the shadows, it's making them cooler. What it's also doing is slightly lifting the shadows with the luma. So how you go about doing this is selecting each color individually, setting each point here and here by holding Alt and selecting it. This is generally the film standard. So moving away from the curves, because you can basically just play around with them and see what you like. I've decreased the key by quite a bit, so to 0.4, and that kind of lets you make the curves bigger and easier to understand without like clustering them all together, because this decreases its effect. So these three nodes here don't actually have much of an effect on the final piece, but it adds a few things like fringing and a blur on the outsides and this kind of green chromatic aberration that changes based on the color. But if you look at this light on the right, you can see it really takes the edge off of it, and as some people say, the digital edge, and it removes it, and it adds that kind of light shift, which, I mean, seemingly in these dark areas isn't very nice. But let me show you how it works. So the vignette is just a simple vignette, and what I've done is I've increased the mist blur, then decreased the exposure, and then with the blur, I've unlinked the blur by pressing this button in the top left and increased red and blue. It basically changes which color prevails. You can also mess around with the HV ratio, which basically changes it from horizontal to vertical. And then once again, I've reduced the key output. This curve is just one curve of luma versus saturation, which basically reduces the saturation in the shadows, because generally if there's a lot of saturation in the shadows, it introduces a lot of grain. You can drag this out. Basically what it means is this is the darker part of the image, and then the higher up is the more saturation, the lower down is less saturation. So generally you create something like this. Finally, this CST out is Davinci wide gamma, Davinci intermediate into Rec 709 and gamma 2.4. If you're using a Mac, these sometimes change. So a couple of weeks ago it was Rec 709 and Rec 709A. And that stops a gamma shift from happening when you export it, which basically means when you export it, it looks different to when you're color grading it, which is obviously horrible. Make sure Rec 709, gamma 2.4, and it's wide gamma and intermediate. So you've also got to make sure the false colors is to the right of the color space transform out, because then that's reading what you see on the screen instead of before the CST, which would be the log image. So once you've color graded the one clip, as you can see in here, you want to right click and press grab still, and this will bring it up into the gallery page here. And then you want to either go to your next clip by clicking on it, or select them all by holding shift and pressing to the end of them. And then you can right click on the grade that you've just done and press apply grade. And then you can see that this clip, if I select all the nodes and press Command D to disable them, turn it on and off, you can see that it has a similar look to the other clip. But what you have to do is reset these nodes definitely, and then possibly reset these nodes depending on what the clips look like. So you can right click, reset node grade, and then turn these off by pressing Command D, and same with these. And then you work on neutralizing your clip. So you'd want to change the exposure so that the skin is in the correct exposure, change the balance to bring it away from cyan, and change the contrast so that you make it all neutral like you did first with the other clip. These you normally would do for each individual clip. So for example, these windows I don't think look very good for this clip, so I'm going to leave them off. And then once you've neutralized it and add the specific clip ones, then you can turn on your scene nodes and then turn on your timeline nodes once you've done all of that. So of course I haven't properly done the grade on this because I need to change the exposure, balance and contrast. But if you do that in that order, it should mean that all of your clips are consistent in what they look like. And then the other main thing is in the deliver panel. This is quite important because it makes sure that you can relink the files into Final Cut and create the full circular workflow. We'll just go from the top down and you just select where you want it to be. So I'll just select this. I'll create a new folder called Davinci Resolve. You want to create a folder that's different to your source files because you don't want them to be overwritten. And you want to be able to select the difference. Format MP4, Kodak H.265 if you're using a camera that has 422 color bit depth. I found MP4 is the best in terms of storage and quality. I leave these two. I leave render timeline effect. Render at source resolution needs to be on so that it takes the source clip, adds the color grading, and then exports the source clip. Leave these both off. Quality, I tend to leave it automatic. Leave optimize for speed off because I don't want the quality to be reduced, just so that it's faster. Encoding profile, if your camera can record in 10-bit color, then you want to make sure you're using one of these two. If it doesn't, you can use main. The difference between main 10 and main 42210 is that main 10 is 420, so it removes some of the information for the color, which doesn't change what it looks like, but it reduces the ability to further edit the look, which I don't like because when I bring it into Final Cut, I might add another light on top. So I changed this to main 42210. Multipass encodes is basically whether you want Davinci Resolve to go over the clip twice. So you can have it scan the clip once, apply the effects, and then do it again to make sure it's the highest quality. It does double the time that it takes to export it. So if it doesn't matter how much time it takes, then turn that on, and if it does, then turn it off. If I'm color grading a big project, I'll turn on multipass encode and then actually put my whole computer in the fridge because it gets so hot because it just takes so much time. Make sure frame reordering is off, otherwise you'll get the clip, pull it into Final Cut, and there'll be black frames every 3 frames. Open up advanced settings, June 2024. For Mac, it's Rec 79 Gamma 2.4, so that there's no gamma shift. I leave all of these to the normal, leave this, leave this, leave this. Then go back to the top, click on audio. Channels, you have to do same as source because one of the ways that Final Cut relinks files is it checks how many audio sources there are. So that has to be kept same as source. Render 1 track per channel. To then go into file, you want it to be source name as well because otherwise Final Cut won't relink it. You can leave subfolder, leave this, leave all of this. You can also use unique file names, which you can add basically custom text before or after. Everything else you can basically leave. Add to render queue, shows up here, and then you can do render all. Now you want to select basically what you are rendering. You can see here, render entire timeline or in-out range. To select an in-out range, you can basically right-click on the first clip you want to render, mark in, and then right-click on the last clip and mark out. And you can see it grays out everything to the left and the right, and it says render in-out range. If you add to render queue, you can see it only adds the one clip, which is this clip. Then if you want to add everything again, just change in-out to entire timeline. You want to make sure that you've turned on your timeline effects before you render everything. So make sure these are all on. So obviously you're leaving them off when you're color grading everything. So now we'll be shifting from Davinci Resolve back into Final Cut. And like I said before, you can do this at any point in your editing kind of process. Okay, so we've exported everything into this DVR file, which is separate to our original clip. And so we're going to jump into Final Cut Pro. There are basically two ways that you can do this. One is just import the newly graded clip into a separate keyword collection in Final Cut and just drag them on top. But that obviously doesn't work if you've done an edit like this, because it will just bring in the clip as default. So what I'm going to do is show you how to do it. So if you select all of your videos that you've graded and then go File, Relink Files, Original Media, and then All, locate all, and then find where you put the graded clips, DVR. You just select the file, DVR, I call it DVR for Davinci Resolve, and then click choose, and it'll go through and relink all the files. You can check here and then click relink files, and if you look, you'll see it change into the graded version. So now you've got the built-in Rec 709 graded version. So yeah, I find this a really easy way of color grading and integrating with everything. And then from here, you just export it from Final Cut Pro. You can export it from Final Cut Pro using compressor settings, which I'll show you now. So center compressor, new batch. What I'm gonna do is create a new custom preset here. So new preset called, let's call it Insta Post Horizontal. It's going to be MPEG-4, which is MP4. It's going to show up here, and then what I'm going to do is open up the secrets panel on the right here, Show Inspector. Now this has all of our interesting settings that we want to change. So you can change the name, change the default location, which I like to do desktop. All of this you can basically leave, and then video is the important bit. So frame size, you want to do it as horizontal or vertical. This one's horizontal, so I'm going to do 1080p because that's what Instagram accepts. Frame rate, automatic, or you can set it to what your camera does, which is 25. But make sure that you set it correctly, because if I was to set it to 50, for example, it would add in extra frames, like computationally. Color space, Rec 709, because you've exported it Rec 709. Raw to log, none. Camera LUT, none. Codec, I tend to leave it at H.264 for Instagram. Profiles high to get as much information. Entropy mode is CAVAC, which has higher quality. CAVLC is an older version. Keyframe interval, don't need to leave that. Average bitrate, social platforms, already does it for you. Multipass again, do it twice. Allow frame reordering, turn that off. Cropping, padding, rotation, all of these you can change for yourself. Yeah, so that's all the video effects, and then audio, you can pretty much leave these because it compresses it down itself anyway, but you can search up the bitrate of the platform and change it to that. So once you've set all these settings, you can then just drag it from the left into edit. It has your default location, and then just start batch, and that'll export it. Yeah, so that'll just export it. Export your whole video exactly how you want it, the right settings. If you then upload that to Instagram, that'll have the highest possible quality with the CAVAC and the multipass and the 1080p, all that kind of stuff. For Instagram, you never want to export in 4K because they'll just compress it down. And then of course for other platforms, you can change those settings like 4K. And if you just search up the right settings for YouTube, you just search up best settings for YouTube, best entropy mode, best quality, best bit depth, all this kind of stuff. Yeah, so that's the whole workflow.